So the first part will focus on EMS on a top level, high-level performance EMS in sport, and we have got a highly renowned speaker. Dr. Heinz Kleinöder is here. He's one of the leading researchers in EMS here in Germany. Has been at the German Sports University in Cologne for nearly 30 years. And here in the Department of Strength Training and Diagnostics, this is what he focuses on. And of course, there is also EML, vibration included, and the impact on health and performance. Many scientific publications have been released on EMS by the professor. He's also part of the EMS expert group, just like nearly all the speakers you will hear today. We will get a current overview of the status quo of EMS, what research tells us about the integration of EMS, in particular with regard to high-level sports, which functionalities, which effects does EMS have on improved bounce, finish and initial speed. And, Dr. Heinz Kleinöder is going to elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased that I was invited to present. As you can see, I've prepared some results, top-level results. It is about competitive and highly competitive sports. 2 current completed studies will be presented after my introduction. This is from competitive sports, Nordic skis and EMS throwers or launchers from Leverkusen. And this is really the latest scientific findings. And to conclude, I will actually tell you about the lessons learned from all of the studies we've completed, because we've actually dealt with EMS for 15 years now. In my introduction, I would like to generally tell you what science can tell us, and I will cover some current knowledge before I conclude with the studies. What is EMS about? It is important from my point of view to know that we actually trigger a contraction. This is an arbitrary muscle contraction, and that can be designed in different ways with different training tools. And we now have to think about the mechanical burden, the EMS dose, the contraction, to see what is important and useful for competitive sports people. It is quite striking to really see how much must be applied because the pain threshold is, of course, the limit. And, of course, safety aspects also need to be considered. Full exertion is definitely not always in the foreground. There are few problems occurring, even with full exertion. I will talk about safety at a later stage. We actually work with sub-maximum strength, 70%, also for competitive sports people, in order to cover the complete range of movement. This is probably different from what some of the other EMS studios do. Sub-maximum whole body EMS, of course, correlates to body weight. Then discipline-specific training is important, and you will see a few things about that. Then strength training with various additional burdens or loads or strains. When you actually do a discipline and then add EMS, is this a helpful or beneficial combination? And for endurance training, we also have findings. Let's have a look at a few images here. This is the static, easy or simple training, and here you can see a combined training with your own body weight or using the slings or the ball, for instance. So there is a variety of tools you can add, and you will be introduced to the study results. I'm very grateful to have a wonderful study by Dr. Filipovic, and he's sitting in this room here. A while ago, he has studied everything regarding the impacts of strength and EMS. There are many, many studies related to EMS, so it is a very well-researched method. You don't have to have any safety or security considerations. So there are very few reasons to believe that there are any risks involved, even in high-intensity applications. So this is whole body versus local EMS, then in various configuration, isometric, dynamic, isokinetic, and for different diagnostics, isometric diagnostics, you look at the bounce, you look at the impulse, at the maximum force, then you do a dynamic diagnostics, and the parameters we would like to focus on is diagnostics of bounce, acceleration speed, and the various diagnostics that we apply to measure bounce. And let's look at the results now. And I will not conclude my presentation after this. This is just my introduction. Here you can see the various studies. If you're interested, they are actually listed in the annex. And the results are really nice regarding hypertrophy and maximum force, 23% for the trained persons. And with athletes, these results are even higher and better because they have a better physical perception. You can see many studies performed in competitive sports, weightlifters, swimmers, and summary is there are significant effects in terms of maximum strength and muscle hypertrophy. When you focus on bounce and acceleration speed, then we don't have as many results because bounce and acceleration speed are a different matter. So when you look at this, this is the bounce, this is the increase to maximum force. So how quickly can I achieve maximum strength? This would be the bounce. We also did a wonderful study ourselves on this, and we had clear improvements achieved with EMS, especially when it comes to the leg flexion muscles. This is important for sprinting in football, for instance, for football players. Then there are combinations with significant results. And where you actually combine classic strength training against hypertrophy and combine it with EMS training. And there's significant improvements. So both for bounce and performance. Let me add, these are studies that were published in PubMed in scientific publications, strictly controlled, so there's always a biofeedback carried out. Let's look at strength endurance now. Again, the adaptation is also very high, 30 to 40%, as you can see here. This is really extreme. And again, you will conclude or can conclude that there's significant improvements on strength and endurance. And when you look at sprinting and jumping, then you can see that a wide variety of sports people can improve their results. 4.8% for ice hockey players. For swimming, it's around 1.45%. But when we're talking about high competitive sports, then of course athletes are very good already, and they only have to improve very little to win. Let's talk about Dr. Filipovic's studies again. He studied football players and acceleration speed and shooting speed, both in the training group and in the athletes group. In the EMS group, the improvements were really significant. So shooting speed of 85 was increased to 100 kilometers. This is quite a magnitude. Briefly, an outlook regarding some of the applications that you have probably not heard about. Nordic combination. You can also find results for this now. The results are more of an observational nature. In dry training, for instance, you increase the impulse in order to be able to recruit muscle fibers. So this worked fine. And with Hakol Schorsch at the Trainers Academy, you will not hear about this. We actually train the belly and the back, because this is really important for sledging, and the pedal movement, which is so important to accelerate the sleigh, the bob. And this can be ever so well trained with electromyostimulation. I was at the training center, I was invited, but such projects unfortunately don't produce scientific results in the strict sense of the word. They are done, and many people say we want to keep it to ourselves for understandable reasons. But what you can reveal are these studies here. And this is what I want to focus on in the rest of my presentation. This is two current projects with the Federal Institute for Sports Science. It's about EMS for Nordic ski and with the EMS at the Trainer Academy in Cologne. It takes you a long while to find people at the Trainer Academy Cologne who are willing to do such studies with sports people. You usually have a preset design that you want to carry out, and it probably does not fit the periods. And this is why we now have new studies from the Federal Institute for Sports Science. So the university actually calls upon us to sit down with the trainers, with the coaches, and then we actually plan the study design and we actually build it into our periodical system. Such projects are then on, and there are two that I would like to introduce you to. In 2017, they were actually initiated and completed in late 2018 and in early 2019. This is why I can actually present the results. Nordic skiing is the first example. For the young talents, we want to find out whether we can introduce EMS, first of all, to support discipline-related strength, but to also increase precision for biathlon. And they, of course, have to be able to run, so acceleration was important. And we wanted to see whether it makes sense to couple EMS with the double thrust employment. Here again, this is an image showing the time for the holding time. The athletes know they have to stay in the target area for 10 seconds. Deviations are measured. And here the point is to cover the longest distance possible. And of course, technical observation, whether the technical execution remains precise. 23 athletes took part. The biathlon training group was interested in increasing the core strength, whereas the cross-country skiing group wanted to actually increase the double stick thrust technology. Most studies 84 hertz and 340 microseconds of pulse width. And I will show you this now. So it was a classical design that we used. Here you can see the various groups, how they were subdivided, the training time per week, 15 hours roughly. The athletes were between 17 and 18 years old. And they actually had achieved strength training experience. They looked back on 3 to 4 years of experience. The biathlon group trained for 14 weeks, added 12 additional training units. There was one group training with EMS and one group that actually continued its regular training as a control group. They just pursued their regular standard training. Each unit was made up of 2 sets with 16 different stabilization exercises for the trunk. And in cross-country skiing, we actually trained for 16 weeks. And here again, this is the training intervention. This is the intensity for the EMS group, so a classical design. It was a bounce design, whole body. The double stick thrust units are really hard. It's going uphill, downhill. It was 3 passages with the following protocol. And here you can see that the impulse time was adapted to the technology. So 0.6 seconds of on time and 0.5 seconds of off time. Here you can see the stabilization unit. So this is whole body EMS in combination with stabilization training. And on the other hand side, you can see the EMS training at the USB in Thüringen. Diagnostic procedures were carried out by Jens Hilbrich. They actually carried out isometric strength diagnostics, and they also actually did a double stick thrust test, and they did the holding test or the stability test for shooting. This is the last 2 images before I want to present the results of this study. And we actually can compare it to what we've seen before, and these are the results. This is the double thrust performance test, the group plus 2.3% without in the EMS group, and the control group plus 3.7%. But when you look at the individual athletes, this is really exciting. This is the EMS group, and somebody has actually increased or improved by 8%, but there's also somebody who actually did not fare so well. And the control group is far more homogeneous. There's just one outlier in this control group. So especially when it comes to competitive sports where people work really hard, you really have to focus on the intensity and how much you can introduce and how well you actually plan the EMS training units. Then the extension of the trunk force in the EMS group, plus 11%, in the control group only plus 4.9%. So EMS worked ever so fine for this. And there's one athlete that is a true outlier. He improved by 35%, even more, in terms of force. This is enormous. Some decreased in performance, and others were like in the middle field. They're between 1% and 5%. So the results are quite interesting. So the people who really respond well, inflection, excellent results, plus 16.1% in the EMS group, plus 7.4% in the control group. And when you look at the individual results, they're all above the average. Everyone has improved in terms of percentages, and some of them even improved by more than 20%. It's few people only, but it is exciting to see this when you actually focus on competitive sports people. So the median value here is not really important. Then holding time or stability. This is an exciting result. In the EMS group, almost stagnant. In the control group, clearly improved. And you can see here, okay, there's a very wide spread, especially in the EMS group. So in terms of stability, we have not seen any improvements. And the variations, the personal variations, are pretty wide. Probably we have to think about a different way of applying EMS. Let's sum up. We also looked at the lactate concentration right after the thrust test, the performance test with 2 sticks. This remained unchanged. The control group showed comparable values, not a lot of difference. Interesting to note is that this double thrust technology was rated by experts, and there was a better result for both groups. The EMS group was leading, so they had a clearly improved mobility and movement procedure, which is easy to understand. Then we saw there was a clear improvements both in extension and inflection. We had rotation and lateral flexion, but I did not include these results. But in summary, it can be said that the control group was better or fared better. This probably can be attributed to the fact that the abilities gained had to be transferred to the discipline first. So for young talents, especially when it comes to trunk stability, which is so important, we were able to improve this significantly. For complex loads or strains, we have to think about different designs, probably not necessarily the classic design. You have to take a more broad-based approach and actually personalize the training units. Let's now look at the second study and the results we obtained there. The title is pretty long, and I want to read it out. Development and the establishment of whole-body electromyostimulation interventions for federal athletes to improve muscle performance in track and field throwing disciplines, so discus, hammer, to prepare international competitions. Leverkusen is a big center for field and track, or track and field sports, very well equipped, and they do specific diagnostics. This is for discus throwing. Then, of course, the thrower is controlled here, and then there is the one-hand acceleration for the sledge, and you can see the sledge, and the sledge actually measures the speed, the throwing speed. And the question was, of course, how can you actually use EMS in a meaningful way to increase performance? We actually used 3 team athletes, javelin throwers, and one from the discus throwing team. We went for a 6-month intervention phase, and we applied the classical protocol, so submaximal at 70%, bipolar. And we actually carried out specific exercises with simultaneous whole-body EMS. And we also draw up a training catalog. And we focused really on the disciplinary specific exercises. And the diagnostics, these tests were run in Leverkusen at the training center. This is some add-on information, how we measured with a radar sensor, for instance, ball speedometer. And we also applied different loads. So without any additional load, plus 1.2 kilograms, plus 2.4 kilograms, and plus 4 kilograms. And the same applied to the discus-specific diagnostics. They were actually done at 1 kilogram and 1.5 kilogram as an additional load. Let's look at the discus discipline. And you can see here it is throwing. Plus 1 kilogram, she improved her speed from 70.1 meters per second to 17.9 meters per second, so plus 4.7%. And with 1.5 kilograms of additional load, she was able to increase from 15 meters per second to 15.6 meters per second. This is the C team. Let's look at the Olympic team of throwers, the top competitive sports people here. And here you can see the results of athlete number 2 for javelin, plus the additional loads. This is without additional loads, plus 1.2% kilograms, plus 2.4 kilograms, plus 17.3% achieved through EMS. This actually reduces to plus 9.8% at an additional load of 1.2 kilograms. With an additional weight of 2.4 kilograms, only plus 2.0%. And this is also reflected in the athlete, the Olympic athlete, plus 10% roughly improvement. This is giant. And as soon as the weight increases, the improvements remain stagnant as at 0%. So here again, in summary, the biggest improvement were achieved without any additional loads or with light, small additional loads. Since if we do not actually add any additional weight, then we actually decrease the regeneration periods. Speed, to increase the speed of a movement is much harder. So it can clearly be said that EMS, whole body EMS, can be recommended for competitive sports. And the German Institute for Sports Science also asked us to produce a training catalog. Admittedly, it is very hard to identify this. We use the sling trainer, and here you can see, or at least assume what we did. This is what we do with the sling trainer, anything related to throwing. This was done in addition with EMS, and the same with the Terra band in combination with whole body EMS, then with ball, and a number of specific exercises and workouts that the trainers came up with. So there was also a specific training catalog. Of course, this does not have to do with any amateur sports people. This is really about competitive sports people. And in summary, it can be said that we had no negative effects seen in the study. We had an increase in the throwing speed, especially the high quality team athletes benefited from whole body EMS. Let me touch upon a point that is important to me. This is practically my outlook. There was a study conducted by a colleague of mine involving sports students. They are our guinea pigs, so to speak, before we actually apply it to competitive sports people so that we can learn from our mistakes. We did strength diagnostics with them, acute adaptation reactions were studied. But I don't want to walk you through the study. I'd rather introduce you to the two groups. We had one group undergoing a standard strength training, and it had actually repetitions, 10 repetitions, max 10 repetitions. So very high intensity. And then this training was repeated involving EMS. Same thing. So strength training plus EMS. And this is the classical design again that I introduced you to before. Let me summarize the results. They are really, really indicative. There was neither a metabolic nor a hormonal adaptation, negative adaptation. There is an additional slight activation through EMS of the muscles. And I have a prolonged rehabilitation time. When I add EMS and I have a high-intensity training, then this is not very helpful. So the one stimulus actually counterbalances the other stimulus. EMS should rather be used to do the job instead of having the mechanical load do the job. So for competitive sports people training at the limit, I would not advise to add EMS. It's not a good idea. We have to make sure that we know exactly where we can introduce meaningful additional stimuli. And this is here, basically. To actually promote the motory abilities, then use whole body EMS in combination with transfer tasks like sprints or jumping. EMS works particularly well to prevent hamstring injuries. EMS is great for doing this. And dynamic training with EMS is basically an alternative solution. the regeneration times can be actually shortened. And the limitation is that we don't really know how to control the intensity. We have the 85 hertz, we've got the on and off times. But to solve this problem, we have come up with this new project here, just approved by the Federal Institute. And the theme is the evaluation of the applications of whole-body EMS in periodical schemes for high competitive training. So the different designs are of interest, maybe 50 hertz only, all the way to the implementation in competitive sports, so that we can be even more specific. So this is the latest project, and this is Outlook number 2. And it does not necessarily have to do with competitive sports. You might think airport, site fire brigade. Well, if I tell you that 70% of their body weight needs to be carried by firemen in terms of respiratory protection systems, the helmet, the hard hat, so they really have to carry heavy loads. And it is our task to actually keep them fit over the entire lifespan. And this is why EMS is interesting. So this will be one of the next few projects, a project where we will actually include EMS in the professional training units. So this is the next 2 projects in the pipeline. And you can actually go through the literature list here. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Dankeschön.
Thank you very much for this, well, tremendously extensive first insight into EMS training. Plenty of points included where we could come in. Maybe you have got questions you would like to ask our expert right now, because his expertise is highly competent and he's only available now for questions maybe outside later on. Should you have, well, a few questions that pop up later on, but maybe it's interesting to everybody.
Sie haben gerade gesagt, dass die Intensität 70% der Schmerztoleranz ist. Wie wird das festgestellt? Auch durch Borg-Skala oder wird das andere?
Sorry, the interpreter cannot hear the question. It's relatively difficult. We work via MVC, and you take the abdominal scale in order to estimate it. Well, you have got a matter which is not easy to tackle. Each and every international publication asks you for that. This is why you do it. But in strength training, it's just the same. The 100% value maximum strength will fluctuate around 20% every day. If I measured one muscle group now and 1 hour later, there would be a difference. It also is subject to repetitions and what factors it is subject to. So it's not an easy thing, but you have to use international standards.
Any other questions? Yes, please. You showed some outliers in the EMS group. Can you actually explain this?
Well, I'm grateful for this question. It's a nice one, extremely important. There's one thing you have to imagine. We take the EMS, stimulus, for instance, and it meets a highly complex structure. A leisure time, athlete doing sports once or twice a week, no problem whatsoever. But you do have athletes out there. If we take the Olympic team, for example, it's 20, 25, 30 hours of sports they do every week. And then when EMS is applied too intensely, it may have an adverse effect. When we have the throwers, we have them do this once a week, just once a week, to be sure that we do not expose them to too much. And then I might have cases where it goes wrong. So whenever I use EMS in competitive sports and I intensely use it, I actually have to be highly alert. I have to do endurance monitoring and stress monitoring to see when is it too much, when is it not enough? We also conducted other studies. After 3 days of rest, we could measure. We would get different values. So it's just an on-the-spot measurement. A competitive athlete, a top athlete, is right at the very limit. And when I go too far, then the whole system temporarily collapses. And for a top athlete, it's more probable than for a recreational athlete who is then guided through EMS training by a personal trainer. So it is an intense, stimulus. And top athletes do have another problem. They move along. They've got their normal strain and stress, their normal endurance, and they do not want to deviate one tiny little millimeter from that. And then you have to see that some sort of mechanical stimulation is taken out and replaced by EMS. But some don't, cope with it, mentally speaking. And it's easy to explain when you look at these individual cases, and you can discuss them with the athlete and adjust the situation. But this wasn't what I wanted to do. Well, I wanted to tell you this is what it looks like in practice. Of course, I get an equilibrium, a mean value, but I get my standard deviation and in individual cases. You can easily understand them. It's simply due to this, narrow reserve in terms of adjustment.
Oh, that's on. Great. The training, when you train these athletes who've actually gone through 25 or more hours of training, do you include the EMS training, or did you actually eliminate some other training units to replace them by EMS?
I have to give you an honest answer. There was a strain monitoring that was conducted. I haven't shown it here. And subject to that, some part of normal standard training was taken away to relieve them. And this is correct. And maybe it's unusual for studies. We took the athlete as a line of orientation, see K values very high, then we did more or less, depending.
Okay, and if we're talking about regular people, not athletes, who actually want to do fitness or yoga, and how do you actually integrate EMS then in the ideal way? I, for instance, I'm a private EMS user, so I do it for flexibility. I also do strength training. But I would probably like to see better results in strength training when I do EMS.
You would like to enhance your strength training. EMS has got a clear potential that is different from mechanical training, less strain and stress on the passive structures, and this is a benefit. You can get to different muscle fibers. You get deep into certain regions of the body, the back, the abdominal area is interesting here. And what is a basic principle here? When you plan your own personal training, you have to focus on your well-being or that of your clients. Functional training means that the stimulus is aligned with the felt, the perceived exertion of the customer. And there it doesn't make any sense to move up and go to the very maximum. No, the opposite is the case. So whenever you've got a top athlete and they've got a good perception of their own body, you will also have it as an experienced athlete. But when you've got an inexperienced customer, well, the opposite is the case. And this is why you have to be very careful in your approach. You have to dose it. And I would always say an EMS training is functional when you put priority on the customer, have sub-maximum work. You start with once a week and you can leave it at that. And with the athletes, we only applied EMS once a week. In theory, twice a week would be possible based on the studies, but it's not a necessity. And accordingly, I worked plan the training in such a way that the EMS effects is something you wait for and that you don't hit very hard and you destroy somebody. Well, this isn't training. Training is a systematic stimulus, customer related. So you start with a sub-maximum, you see the positive effects, you can increase intensity, etc. So this would be the approach. In, well, competitive sports, I don't know how to put it. For recreational sports, you've got more possibilities, whether you've got 50, 60, 70 hertz. Well, it's similar to strength training, whether you have got 30% strength and endurance or hypertrophy, the maximum strength will improve.
Thank you. This is exactly what I wanted to know.
I simply wanted to be sure that I understand your conclusions correctly regarding the tests in the throwing area. So when I have got an EMS stimulus with plenty of weight or strength training, when I associate it with that the results are not so good, it would be better, you say? Well,
simply means you don't need it. You could actually use both, nothing against it, but then please separate the units. One unit of strength, apply it mechanically with dumbbells, equipment, whatever, and the other unit should be an EMS unit. But combining it at a high intensity actually only results in longer regeneration times, periods, but not a higher performance because the stimuli no longer complement each other, but the mechanics actually are dominant and the EMS only prolongs the regeneration periods. In the long term, it might serve as a very tough approach to really push performance. But in this group, I would not actually promote it. I would not recommend it.
So it's interesting because I live in France. I've got EMS studios in France, and it's a young, an immature market, and it's not understood by most of them. Most of the sports coaches do exactly that.
Well, we, of course, tend to make the training more intense and think that the results improve. But when we do it, I'm not against it, don't get me wrong, but let's go about it in a smart way. You don't have to add on, keep adding on, and see, oh, now this person is really exhausted, high intensity, that was a great training, I'm really exhausted. Yes, you can do it once when the customer is really advanced, but this is not a health-focused type of training, absolutely not. Not even fitness-focused. This is a special case, an extraordinary case to really promote top performance, but please don't apply it to standard trained persons. This is just high risk for you.
I don't do that, he said. Well, sorry. Well, I'm not very professional, but I nonetheless have to ask this question. Do you mean that, well, I was also several times I paid visit to an EMS studio, and the trainer always told me, give your everything. I was always brought up to the very limit. My gut feeling, because I do a lot of sports privately, I was told I would move towards injuries. I would do something that gets me close to something. So training at the very limit, this is what our German studios say, 90% it's wrong.
You don't have to. Why? Why should you do it?
Well, so they really kill me with this device, but that's not correct.
Every training up to the last limit bears certain risks. And if you're really focused on health, I wouldn't simply do it. Of course, when somebody's really experienced, you can drive it all the way up. But the basic rule is that this is superfluous. It should have a specific intensity. This is why you have box cutter. But when I'm at 20 all the time, all out, then I produce a risk on the one hand, and I actually produce longer regeneration periods. This is the logic. Just training once and then do it all at once. Wrong.
Thank you very much. So, Heinz, thank you very much. This was super, but there's one question I do have. Well, how do you view the risk of, well, people not knowing this as a trainer, as an instructor, that you overpace people? We recently had a report, and the WDR, the broadcasting company. What does the situation look like? Because, well, she was quite surprised when she said, well, what's happening there?
Well, there are two views to this. There's a stimulus that is really well researched because it's from rehabilitation. We've now created a new organizational scheme. The manufacturers have created whole body EMS. This is, of course, a very intense approach because it actually involves the whole body. And if I actually look at pace and believe me, our sports students tend to actually find out what the equipment actually can perform, and the students can take very much. We had we've seen this in the study with the water ball players, and they had huge CK values. I can actually test my tolerance for stimulus, for tension, but this is superfluous for standard users. There's a risk whenever I have persons trained that actually come with prior disorders. You don't hear people who don't drink enough, for instance, or who come with other risk factors. And when then I actually go to full exertion, then I run the risk of producing problems. But you wouldn't do this in any other type of sports either. When I wouldn't actually make somebody run 5 times 400 meters who's contracted an infectious disease, a virus, for instance. It is superfluous to actually go for the maximum stimulus. You may have some sore muscles with healthy persons, yes, and you will find this covered in the press. Kidney disorders, for instance. We've been doing EMS at the Sports University for 15 years now. And initially, of course, in ways that do not correspond to what I'm saying now. We actually started with 45 minutes training, and the people weren't even able to walk after the training. But nothing serious ever happened, nevertheless. But as I said, if there's a risk potential, an additional risk potential, and you don't know about it as a trainer, and then you go to full exertion, meaninglessly, then this is an unfunctional training, to put it in one word. Yeah.
One question. So we are talking about diabetes, and diabetes for us, well, is difficult to, well, establish whether it's type 1, type 2, regular injections, not well. How do you view this? How would you train them?
Well, we discussed this at the round table. The experts were all present, and the views varied. Some people said that diabetes can even be very well treated with EMS. I would endorse this. On the other hand, I would add, if you do this, regardless of the risk potential, it is difficult when this is done by a minimum payment force. This should be a fully skilled trainer or supervisor. It is doable, it is feasible, but it requires supervisors who really know what they're doing and who can react in case something really serious occurs. First and foremost, if you have such cases, I have worked with all types of risk groups, but let me tell you, be very careful about it. You have to have an emergency and contingency plan, and you have to be prepared to accept those customers. And if I was in a regular studio without a specific competence, without any doctors near, I wouldn't probably do it.
Well, medical, okay. Well, after that?
Yes, I would always get a doctor's approval, definitely. There's no argument against treating diabetics. I would get the doctor's approval and then actually work out a specific program for such a customer. Also to be able to prove I've done everything required, because if something goes really wrong, then you're on the safe side. All of the research involving creatine kinase when somebody has a kidney renal insufficiency.
I do believe there's another question. Well, there is. Well, the next two speakers are already there. Well, there's one of the next speakers with a question. It's a comment. I was the one who said, come on, well, do it. Well, what could happen with regard to diabetes? And there are some tools where you can live monitor blood sugar levels. They've got a clip, and on your iPhone, on the watch, you can, monitor sugar levels during training. Type 1 diabetics, they will know well themselves. They've known it since their childhood. They know how long to train, when to eat, when to drink, when to, apply an injection, so it's no problem, and they do not simply fall down and lose consciousness. So this potential of fear, in my opinion, is something that's exaggerated. And then I have to say, well, the speaker is right. When you don't know how to continue, when they don't feel well, you have to measure the blood sugar level, and then in case of doubt, they need something to eat, because as a rule, the blood sugar level will be too low. High levels you usually won't have, and there won't be any negative effect of the training. So if you want to be on the safe side, you will either, as we said before, then have a well-trained instructor with high qualifications, and on the other hand side, you will have monitoring via blood sugar devices, and then, nothing should happen. And type 2 diabetics, those who cannot handle their blood sugar levels will hardly ever pay a visit to an EMS studio. Yeah, simply due to the fact that they've got a problem with movement, with motion anyway. If they, had regular exercises, the blood sugar levels wouldn't be that high, but there are exceptions, of course.
Dr. Bernd Kemmerer, the next but one speaker. Thanks very much for your comment. Dr. Kleinöder, thank you very much.